Okay, let's dive into this explainer and uncover the absolutely thrilling, totally untold story of England's first female novelist, Lady Mary Wroth. Now, if you think early 17th century literature was just a bunch of quiet, obedient men and women writing polite little verses to each other, you are in for a serious shock today. We are going to look at the life of a woman who completely defied every rule of her era, airdropped real royal scandals into a massive fantasy epic, and then clapped back at her haters with some incredibly razor-sharp poetry. So we're starting off with a genuine mystery. What exactly could a super intricate monogram on a 400-year-old book reveal about a scandalous Jacobean noblewoman? Ciphers, you see, were basically meant to conceal meanings right in plain sight. They required the viewer to possess some kind of secret insider knowledge. To most people passing by, a cipher just looks like a pretty piece of decoration. But to a trained eye, it's a map to a hidden life. And that brings us to the modern day. Picture this, at the 2019 Battersea Rare Book Fair in London, right in the middle of all these stalls overflowing with old leather and gold, a book detective stumbles upon a surviving manuscript. It was a biography of the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, and it was stamped with Lady Mary Wroth's personal secret cipher. What makes this so mind-blowing is that her entire library was thought to have burned to the ground 2 centuries ago. So this surviving artifact suddenly opened a massive window into a woman who was famously notorious in her own time. Moving into our first section here, the Sydney dynasty, because to really understand the woman behind the cipher, we have to flash back to the 16th century and look at the immense privilege she was born into. Her lineage actually traces back to the famous Sydney dynasty, a family that was just brimming with influential courtiers and celebrated literary minds. Mary Wroth was the daughter of Robert Sidney, the Earl of Leicester. But perhaps even more importantly for her future trajectory, she was the niece of the legendary poet Sir Philip Sidney and Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke. So she was raised in an environment absolutely buzzing with literature, politics, and serious power. But the contrast between society's expectations and her reality was just stark. The Jacobean ideal was that a woman should be a silent, obedient piece of property who never spoke out of turn. But Lady Mary's reality? Well, she was highly educated. She danced before Queen Elizabeth I, and she even starred as an Ethiopian nymph in Queen Anne's Mosque of Blackness. She was an active, highly visible, and very vocal participant in the royal court. Which leads us to Section 2, Scandal, Romance, and a Life of Debt. Because her glittering life at court pretty quickly took a dark turn as she was thrust into the crushing realities of womanhood in her era. At barely 16 years old, she was arranged to marry Sir Robert Wroth, a wealthy landowner who was 10 years her senior. Now, officially linking these two powerhouse families might have looked like a great move on paper, but the reality behind closed doors was grim. Sir Robert was allegedly a spendthrift, a heavy gambler, and a drunkard. The word around court was that he hunted while she danced. Even the famous playwright Ben Jonson publicly noted that Mary was unworthily married to a jealous husband. Let's just map out the rapid succession of tragedies that completely derailed her life. After a decade of a really difficult marriage, her husband died of gangrene in 1614. Just 2 years later, their only infant son passed away. And because of how wildly unfair property laws were at the time, the entire estate returned to her husband's nearest male relative, leaving Mary completely deprived of her own property. Worse still, she was drowning in £23,000 of debt, which was a literally astronomical, bankrupting sum for the early 1600s. And if you think that's where the drama ends, well, amidst all this financial ruin, she engaged in a scandalous, illicit affair with her first cousin, William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. They were actually childhood friends who shared this passionate interest in art and literature, but it ended in total heartbreak. She bore him 2 illegitimate children, whom he completely refused to acknowledge. Compounding all of this tragedy, this scandal, along with her financial constraints, played a massive part in her eventual withdrawal and straight-up exile from Queen Anne's inner circle. So, what does she do next? Let's get into Section 3, Pioneering Literature. Amazingly, she managed to channel all of that intense real-life heartbreak, financial ruin, and courtly exile into revolutionary art. In 1621, she published The Countess of Montgomery's Urania. It was actually the first known prose romance written by an English woman, and it completely shocked the Jacobean world. Why? Because it was a roman à clef.
She essentially aired all of the royal court's dirty laundry, disguising real, scandalous events and real people behind this sprawling fantasy epic. She took the trauma of the traffic in women literally being traded as property, and wrote it directly into her fiction. Let's look at her sonnets for a second, because it builds on this beautifully. Attached to the Urania was a sonnet sequence called Pamphylia to Amphilanthus, and in it, she completely flips male-dominated literary tropes on their head. Traditionally, in Petrarchan poetry, the woman is just this silent, unattainable object of desire. But Wroth, she made the male the unattainable object of love. Her female protagonist actively demands loyalty and constancy from a fickle man, which is, for sure, a direct reflection of her own tragic relationship with William Herbert.
Okay, Section 4. The Urania Outrage. As you can probably guess, holding up a mirror to the hypocrisies of the powerful Jacobean court sparked an absolute firestorm. Enter Lord Edward Denny, Baron of Waltham. Recognizing his own family's dark secrets thinly veiled in her book, he was outraged, and he aggressively attacked her. He didn't just send a private, angry letter, though. He wrote and widely circulated a vicious poem calling her a hermaphrodite in show, indeed a monster. He was essentially claiming that by writing and publishing fiction, she had abandoned her gender entirely.
But remember, Lady Mary was a Sidney, and she was absolutely not going to back down. She fired right back with a razor-sharp, mocking response that brilliantly weaponized his own words against him. She called him a hermaphrodite in sense, in art a monster, and a drunken poet who penned vile, railing, and scandalous things. She even brazenly challenged him to avert it to her face. I mean, what a spectacular, fearless defense of her own voice.
Moving to our final section, her enduring legacy. Now, despite that epic clapback, the intense backlash did eventually force her to withdraw from public life, and she actually had to pull many copies of her book from sale. But, importantly, her creative spirit was never truly extinguished.
Get this, she continued writing in secret. Between the published first part of Urania and the second volume she wrote in manuscript form, she penned a staggering 590,000 words. That is a massive, sprawling cinematic universe of characters and political plots. That unpublished sequel survived only in manuscript form, passed down quietly until it was finally published in 1999, which firmly secured her place as a true titan of early modern literature.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves, how much richer would our literary history be if more women possessed the unapologetic audacity of Lady Mary Wroth? Think about it. She faced a society that demanded her silence, a husband who resented her, and a royal court that exiled her. Yet she left behind a secret cipher, a massive epic, and a legacy of defiance that paved the way for every female novelist who followed in her footsteps. It honestly makes you wonder whose stories we are still missing today, simply because they weren't quite as fearless.